Good morning, everyone, and good evening to our audience joining from different time zones, including Korea. Welcome to GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWIX. I'm Yeon-ho Kim, Associate Director at GWIX. And thank you for joining our Korea Policy Forum. The forum is a part of the policy program at GWIX, focusing on discussing current Korea-related policy issues in the domestic, regional, and global context. And today's forum is co-hosted by the U.S. China Policy Institute at Aju University and co-sponsored by the East Asia National Resource Center. I would like to express my special thanks to Dr. Hoong-Kyu Kim, Director of the U.S. China Policy Institute, who initiated this great project of inviting leading experts from the U.S. and Korea to this roundtable. And today we will discuss changing dynamics of U.S.-China strategic rivalry in the first session, and then the implications for the U.S.-Korea relations in the second session. I wish I had enough time to introduce all the roundtable participants one by one, but for the sake of time, I'd like to ask you to refer to the bios in the program. And in the first session on the U.S.-China strategic rivalry, let me ask Elbrich and Hoong-Kyu to make opening remarks, and then we will open it up for a roundtable discussion. And with that, let me turn it over to Elbrich.
Great. Thank you, Yeon-ho, and thank you to GWIX and the other sponsors for the invitation and the opportunity to appear before such a distinguished panel on such an important topic. I think this is one of the most important and interesting topics, not just in U.S. policy towards Asia, but really around the world. So it's a pleasure to be able to participate. I'm going to be brief and hopefully a little bit provocative and clear to stimulate discussion, but I look forward to the back and forth as well as questions from the audience. I think by now it's pretty clear that U.S.-China strategic competition is a reality that's here to stay and will increasingly shape everything that the United States does and essentially everything that's going on around the world. From the U.S. perspective, China is the most powerful rival the United States has faced since the 19th century, when the United States itself became the largest economy in the world, and in some ways, ever. And at the same time, Asia is now the world's most important region. It's the largest market, and its market share is actually growing. So China's rise and attempt to establish hegemony over Asia is in my view, the clear priority for the U.S. from a geopolitical perspective. In order to blunt this outcome, the United States needs to help lead and sustain an anti-hegemonial coalition to form and sustain itself and block this Chinese goal. And I think we see this process moving along. For a long time, it's been pretty inchoate and a little bit underdeveloped, but I think we've seen an acceleration, particularly since COVID and for instance, China's activities against India. People sometimes identify this anti-hegemonial coalition with the Quad. I think the Quad could be part of this, but I tend to look at this as more of an informal network that will have a lot of different kinds of political relationships. But I think Deputy Secretary Began's comments the other day at an India forum were illuminating on this point. I'd just like to say in this context, because I know it comes up a lot recently, that I don't think this U.S.-China strategic competition is likely to replicate the Cold War. In certain respects, it will probably militarily. It will have features that resemble the Cold War. But I think the Cold War analogy often harms more than it helps discussion. I mean, I don't think there will be two hermetically sealed blocks. Probably what the United States will seek to encourage countries to do will be a selective form of economic decoupling. But there will be rough camps or coalitions probably. I mean, obviously the U.S. Led one, as well as I call it a pro-hegemonial coalition that will probably be composed of states like Cambodia, Pakistan, and others that are actually supportive of Chinese hegemony, given the alternatives. So I think the U.S. core geopolitical goals are going to be to play a leading cornerstone role, is the term I use, in this coalition, because just as a matter of hard power, only the United States is strong enough to lead such a coalition in the face of such a powerful China. And this will have a significant military component. Sometimes there's discussion that the competition with China will be solely economic and political. I think that's a fallacy, and I'm happy to discuss that. But the U.S. will in particular need to focus on defending its treaty allies and Taiwan, which has sort of tantamount to a treaty ally, at the first island chain to prevent Beijing from being able to use its growing military power to slice and dice or in a sequential way use its military power and other instruments of coercion in a focused fashion to break apart this coalition. So that's going to be a very demanding and consuming requirement, which I'll get to again in a little bit. At the same time, as I mentioned, economically, I think the United States will itself and then will encourage other countries like South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, which are already doing this on its own, but to selectively decouple, not to have a hermetically sealed, obviously, but to basically to reduce countries' vulnerability to Chinese coercive leverage, I think will basically be the goal. And I think it's worth noting, I mean, historical analogies are always imperfect, but it's always worth observing that I think Great Britain and Germany, Imperial Germany, were each other's largest trading partners in the lead up to the First World War. So I think a robust economic relationship is not incompatible with strategic rivalry and even conflict, which I'm happy to talk about. But I think that's an important. We're not talking about a fully air-gapped camps. So what's the future of the U.S. Republic of Korea relationship in this context? Well, I think fundamentally the most important thing is that the relationship and the alliance will have to adapt. And in particular, the relationship will need to be seen through this broader regional and geopolitical prism, not merely as a peninsular issue, which it has tended to be in past decades. And in particular, I do think the North Korea issue will increasingly have to be seen in light of the China relationship rather than independently. Obviously, there remains great hostility, skepticism towards Pyongyang in the U.S., but I do think over time, the U.S. is going to have to increasingly focus on China and see the North Korea problem through that lens. In my view, the U.S.-ROC relationship should be on solid ground. I can't speak for Korea, obviously, but based on my observation and travel to Seoul, it does seem like Korea, faces a choice. I think it's fallacy is a little strong, but I think it would be a dangerous course for Korea to try to skate in between the United States and China. It's both the United States and Beijing are going to have an incentive to draw Korea one way or the other, and in fact, a neutral position probably would be, in effect, would be moving over to Beijing's side. Obviously, Korea has a very tough geopolitical position, so it's not an easy choice. But I think the United States is the distant power that has an interest in independent states like South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, India, whereas China is seeking to establish, at least according to the U.S. government and other governments, is trying to establish a predominant position where it can direct the domestic affairs and, of course, the foreign and the defense policies of local states, including South Korea. From the U.S. perspective, on the other hand, South Korea is, of course, a very important economy, one of the largest and most advanced in the world, and it has a very important strategic position, both in Northeast Asia in general, but also as it relates to the defense of Japan, which is, of course, critical to the whole anti-hegemonial coalition position. So the U.S. has a strategic interest in the sustainment of the alliance. And for those who focus more on the ideological aspect, of course, South Korea is also a exemplary liberal democracy, free government. So, to that extent as well, the U.S. has an interest in South Korea if you pay more attention to that aspect. So going forward, as I mentioned, I think the United States, in all respects, but particularly in the military domain, will have to focus much more on China. And its pacing challenge will be the defense of vulnerable allies and Taiwan in particular. In my view, this will actually need to include the Republic of Korea. If you look at the 2020 military Pentagon report on China's growing military power, the military assets that the People's Republic are building are certainly applicable to Taiwan, but they're also directly applicable to South Korea. And, as I said yesterday, I don't think that China is seeking to replicate Genghis Khan. But as the United States itself has shown over the last generation, if you really want to have coercive influence, there's nothing like dominating military power. And I think China will increasingly try to draw political benefit from this military power. So I think the United States will need to include South Korea increasingly in considerations of defense of the first island chain and South Korea itself. And I think the Seoul and the Republic of Korea will also have to think about this. I think Korea's first order of business, though, is, as it's already done commendably, to focus on its own conventional defense against North Korea. As I said, the United States is going to have to focus on China, and that will mean less of a focus on North Korea, particularly conventional forces, less so missile defense and the nuclear deterrent, but particularly conventional forces. I don't think we can afford to concentrate much going forward on North Korea. So South Korea will have to take much more and more of the lead of this. But as I said, I think South Korea is really an exemplary ally in terms of its level of effort on defense and its seriousness. So I commend South Korea on that. And then I think increasingly South Korea will need to begin thinking about defense of the republic against a potential Chinese attack in concert with the United States. That's one where I think the U.S. will have to play the leading role in any scenario. So it seems to me this is a strong basis going forward for the alliance and a relationship. But of course, I look forward to hearing from the other panelists and the audience as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Albrecht warned us that he will be a little bit provocative, but I should say I really loved his background sound, birds singing. Thank you. And before I turn it over to Heung-Gyu, let me make a quick announcement. We're taking questions from the virtual attendees, so please type in your questions in the Q&A box. Although I'm not sure we'll have enough time to take a lot of questions from the attendees. And please make sure to identify your affiliation and name when you type in questions. So, Heung-Gyu.
Okay, good morning for my American friends, and then good evening for my Korean friends. For sure, the alliance with the United States has been the pillar of foreign policies and security of South Korea. No matter who became the president, progressive or conservative. On May 20th, the White House issued the monumental documents on the U.S.-China relations, which is the U.S. strategic approach to China. It was like an echo of announcing the beginning of a new Cold War to the world, even though Albrecht say, we should be very careful to using this kind of vocabularies. Confronting China becomes the organizing principle of the U.S. foreign policies. The address of Mike Pompeo at the Nixon Center on July 23rd, again assured the world the United States entered the new era of a Cold War against China. Due to the U.S.-China strategic competition, South Korea faced the four dilemmas. First, choosing U.S. side dilemma. The main threat of the South Korea is North Korea. China is not. The main threat of the United States is China. However, the United States is the ally of the South Korea. So I recognize there is a kind of existing gap of interest and utility and scope of the alliance between the South Korea and the United States. If there were a major war between the United States and China, I think South Korea would definitely join the United States as an alliance partner. However, the best interest of South Korea is to deter such things happening. For South Korea's fate, no matter who wins, devastating consequences are anticipated. Under the current situation, South Korea is extremely nervous and precarious. Second, the confidence dilemma. Even if South Korea increased by 5 times as requested its financial contribution to the U.S. military presence on the Korean Peninsula, there is no confidence at all the United States military would help in a contingency with nuclear-armed North Korea under Trump administration. Third, peace-building dilemma. Establishing peace with North Korea without denuclearization doesn't guarantee South Korea's security. If it happened, South Korea is likely more vulnerable than before. However, there is little expectation either Trump or Biden would place its policy priority on North Korea's denuclearization. Fourth, decoupling dilemma. If the United States was successful at decoupling South Korea from China, it would ironically damage the South Korea-US alliance. South Korea would be no longer able to finance its alliance unless the United States replaced the role of China in economy, which is not likely. A serious problem is that these dilemmas become a vicious cycle and would bring to South Korea a tremendous risk of national existence. My current and immediate concern is United States Taiwan policy. China firmly declared Taiwan belonging to its core national interest. The United States recognized the principle of one China, and Taiwan is a part of China in Shanghai Communique in 1972. The Taiwan issue has been the bottom line in the US-China strategic cooperation since then. Under the Trump administration, the bottom line is seriously being damaged. A growing concern of military crashes between the United States and China rise. So my question is, how far the United States is going on to go on Taiwan issues? Where the bottom line is? What the differences on Taiwan issues between Trump and Biden? Another issues I am concerned is the US military transformation in this region to deter the advancement of Chinese military. That is the installation of the mid-range of ballistic missiles in the Western Pacific area. And of course, there is the issue of the denuclearization of North Korea we have to discuss. The other serious question to my American friends is what kind of visions for the rest of the world and scope and bottom line in this strategic competition against China the United States has. Anyhow, I sincerely hope how difficult it is. South Korea and the United States find a way out to go together. Go together, this is the slogan of South Korea and United States alliance. Thank you very much for all. I'll toss my, the next to the again.
Thank you, Heung-Gyu. Thank you, Elbridge and Heung-Gyu, for your succinct and very insightful remarks on this important issue from the regional perspective. As I said, in the second session, we will have a time to delve into the US-ROC relations. So for now, I'd like to encourage all the participants and attendees who are typing in their questions to focus on this regional context. So let me open it up to the roundtable participants. Who wants to go first? Yes, I see Bill and Eric. Bill.
There's all of this talk about Cold War with China. I find very, very odd, to tell you the truth. And Elbridge, I like a lot what your webpage says about this not being an ideological battle, as in the real Cold War. To me, this is terribly important to realize the limits of this so-called Cold War. We're really in an economic competition. I love the term competition. Economists love competition. What we don't like is monopoly. We don't like hegemony. You use the word hegemony a lot. To me, though, when I look at China as a very troubled state, to tell you the truth. I don't see it as this giant monster that's going to eat us up or eat Korea up. The idea of sending troops from China to Korea, South Korea is, oh man, we've got enough trouble in the world to worry about things like that. But China is a big problem for all of us in the economic sense, in the sense of state enterprise, state control, limited private companies. Nobody likes to compete against a state. And that, to me, is the focus of our administration now, and hopefully in future, where we focus on making sure China competes in a market-based economy, not in a state-based economy. you can go back to history and say Germany and England, were biggest trade partners. That is a huge misunderstanding of today's economy. In England in those days, I mean, my house is full of Chinese stuff. China's apartments are full of American money. We are so much more integrated than ever before. So the idea of a war between China and a real war is just, it's just not going to happen, believe me. Yeah, a really good issue though is what Mr. Kim says about Taiwan. I'm concerned what's going on with Taiwan. I think all of us are. But imagine from China's perspective, they got to be concerned about Hong Kong. Wow, that's a huge problem. Xinjiang, their own economy is faltering. The virus issue is basically a China problem, right? I mean, I don't mind calling it the Wuhan virus. That's what it is. To me, China is a troubled country. It doesn't have a strong political, it's run by a monopoly communist party that's fraught with trouble, corruption. So I'm thinking Korea and us, we need to focus on making sure China works by the market rules and democratic rules. But I don't think we need to be so worried about a war with China.
Okay, thank you. Eric?
Yes, thanks. And thanks for inviting me. I mean, as usual, I associate myself with almost everything that the Bridge said. We're usually pretty aligned on these issues. I've got kind of notes scattered all over here, so I'm just going to kind of keep it brief. But I think there's a few points that are worth offering, especially for our friends in Korea as they think about this conversation as it's going on in Washington. Three things in particular about what I would call a peacetime competition between major powers. I don't like the Cold War term either, but regardless of what we call it, it's clear that there is a major economic, technological, and military competition going on. What isn't clear is how coalitions are going to come together and what how countries are going to align themselves going forward. And I think Bridge got into that a bit, and I'll comment on that a bit. But to get back to what I was going to say here on Washington's perspective, I worked on the Hill for a long time for a number of congressmen and senators and committees, going back 5 and 10 years. I've never seen a level of bipartisanship on this issue and interest on this issue as we've seen in the last 2 years. That just did not exist even just 4 or 5 years ago. You've got members like Senator Schumer and Senator Cotton who are polar opposites on almost every issue, working together on this topic and writing letters on this issue. So my first point would be that to believe that this is sort of a fleeting moment, that an election is going to change our direction, that this is only heightened because of the coronavirus, this competition, all that's to say that that's just not the case. This is pretty enduring and bipartisan for a number of political reasons. Right now, that bipartisanship has been put to the sidelines, but I think after the election, we'll see a return to that type of cooperation, especially on Capitol Hill. I think we're also seeing in Washington much more of a whole of government approach on these issues. In the past, it was always DOD in the lead, as Bridge said, writing reports on China's military power, seeing kind of that long-term military competition for what it was, but the Commerce Department, Treasury, State to some degree, especially the Justice Department, that was just a different question. We were focused on terrorism, we were focused on global economic questions, we weren't focused on China. Another enduring trend I think we've seen in this administration that we would see is in a Biden 1 or a Trump 2 continue to go on is the importance of our Commerce Department and our Treasury Department and the heightened role they're playing in this competition. So I think if we do see a Biden administration, one of the biggest questions he'll face on China is not who he's going to make Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, but Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of Commerce in a new administration. And then finally, it was also discussed, this topic of decoupling, this word that's thrown around. Obviously, this is a blunt term that really, is easy to throw around in the press, but it's really not what Washington's seeking, or at least, that bipartisan group in Washington. I think we're seeing a maturing of our approach on this topic and trying to understand where, as it was said, China has leverage in our economic relationship and how we might try to unwind that leverage or dilute that leverage. I've talked with a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, many of you know, Brad Glosserman, on a collective resilience, where we seek to create resilience in these specific areas collectively with our friends and allies. Which brings me to the U.S. Korea relationship. In the technology space, we're going to need to find ways to work together, not as a block on China as a whole, but in specific areas where we have or interest-based coalitions. And I think a coalition on technology, where we seek to keep our internet and our technology areas open and free and free of coercion, is a good place to start. And so, there's certainly an opportunity, given the technology role many of our companies play. The American companies, Korean companies in the semiconductor space, SK Hynix and Samsung and others, and then those in Japan and those in Taiwan like TSMC and Sony and others. These four countries have an opportunity to work together collectively to reduce, the role of non-military coercion with China going forward. And so my comments have gone on too long, but I think that that's a little bit of a framing for how Washington's thinking about this and how enduring it's going to be, and how it's maturing as well as we think about this. It's not just the DoD in the lead anymore, as has always been the case in the past, although the military component is critical, as Bridge has written a lot about. And I have a few other comments, but I'll give others a chance to chime in. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Yes, Sung-Han.
Okay, I really enjoyed listening to the two gentlemen's presentation, particularly the Elbridge's presentation was quite stimulating. First of all, I have one comment on your comparison between the Cold War period and today's U.S.-China strategic competition. I agree with you on the point that the current one is different from the Cold War periods in the sense that the U.S.-China economic interdependence is very high, which means decoupling is going to be, realistically speaking, very difficult. That's why I think, use the word of a selective form of economic decoupling. So I think on the U.S. side, I kindly ask you to elaborate and refine the concept of decoupling. Many Koreans as well as other Asian countries tend to understand it as a kind of a very large-scale, comprehensive decoupling, from China, like eliminating China from the global value chain or supply chain, regardless of the types of economy or the sectors or industrial, the corners, etc. So as the previous, the commentator pointed out, I think we need to narrow it down to some strategic area, like high-tech sectors. So that will make South Korea prioritize the relevant issues more easily, unless decoupling is being understood as a comprehensive kind of, the exclusion of China from the global value chain or regional value chain. So that is one point. And the intention of China, you said, Elbridge, China has the intention of establishing hegemony in East Asia. I think this requires further kind of a sophistication and elaboration. This is the issue about the relationship between balance of power and intention. Okay, in terms of balance of power, I think still United States is maintaining superior balance of power vis-a-vis China. But the problem is China's intentions. Then how can you elaborate China's intentions in favor of your current strategy vis-a-vis China. So you need to elaborate the Chinese behavior in dealing with the North Korean nuclear problem. China, we have been expecting China as a helping hands and constructive role for the past 25 years, but it was quite disappointing. China's kind of assertive behavior in South China Sea area, and Chinese kind of very aggressive movements in Southeast Asia, etc., etc. You talked about the Chinese intention to break apart the first island chain within the next decade or so. So these kind of things should be further explained to the public if you try to rationalize your current policy to China. And last point is the front line of U.S.-China strategic competition in Southeast Asia. But if I scrutinize the U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia, I would say I'm pretty much disappointed. Militarily speaking, United States is sophisticating its strategy to neutralize China's A2AD strategy. But politically and economically towards Southeast Asia, if you compare the Chinese ODA to the U.S. ODA, I think it's less than 5%. If you add a Japanese, it's going to be a little bit more than 30% of the Chinese ODA to Southeast Asia. So I think I strongly recommend you to look at Southeast Asia from more comprehensive strategic point of view. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before I ask Albridge to respond to Sung-han's comments, I wonder if we have any comments from the Korean side. Yes, Chae-sung, and then Albridge, why don't you respond to Sung-han or Chae-sung's comments?
Thank you. Several points. First, about the Cold War analogy. I also think that Cold War analogy is somewhat misleading. But if we think back in 1947, when there was a George Buchanan's X article, when he proposed the strategy of containment, didn't expect that the Soviet Union and U.S. rivalry will evolve into very high level of military confrontation. But soon after the Korean War, we have a new phase of the Cold War confrontation using military means. So Secretary Acheson at that time said that Korean War was a war at the right time, at the right place. So suddenly the NSC 68 became the dominant policy guide for the United States. If there is a unexpected short-term but intense military collision in South China Sea, for example, between US and China, then suddenly we'll have a Cold War type of confrontation using military means between two countries, which will have a grave impact upon the security architecture of East Asia. So even though we all think that Cold War analogy is misleading, but there is always a chance for a new phase of the confrontation. The second point is that while the Trump administration's evaluation of U.S.-China policy, as Hung-kyo said, Secretary Pompeo said at the Nixon Library Congress, that the 50 years of engagement with China totally failed because China did not transform itself into the liberal democratic regime. So what will be the standard of evaluating U.S.-China policy for the past 5 decades? But if we look back upon China's behavior in some areas, we succeeded, I think, in engaging with China, because China's behavior is somewhat conforming to the standards of international liberal order. So what should be the standards? third point is that regardless of China's challenge, I think there was a strong failure in maintaining U.S. bipolarity by U.S. grand strategy. U.S. went through three crises during the post-Cold period, 9/11, 2008, and now COVID crisis, which weakened the United States leadership without analytically distinct China's challenge. So even though we succeed in dealing with China's challenge, I think we still have a great task to revive liberal international order, which United States should lead. But now, if you look back upon what Trump administration did, I think U.S. is still lacking the enough intention to do something to revive international liberal order by contributing, some kind of international public goods to international society in many areas. So, what should we do? What should the allies can do to collectively rebuild this liberal international order? Thank you.
Thank you. Elbridge, did you want to respond?
Yeah, no, thanks. These are really insightful and penetrating observations and questions and comments. So I will try to group them sort of together. Particularly, I think Dr. Kim's challenge is a welcome one. Well, as you probably can tell, I'm sort of a classical realist, so you won't hear as much about the liberal international order from me, which I tend to think is to your point, Dr. Chun, is more a derivative of the balance of power than itself is sort of a driving entity. But to Dr. Kim's point, that also means that I tend to look more at countries' power and their relative ability to employ it rather than their intentions. So China would be a problem even if it were led by a Deng Xiaoping type figure because of just the weight and its tremendous growth over the last generation. Because to Dr. Chun's point, that engagement over the last 50 years has been very successful in certain ways, particularly for China, in making it tremendously more wealthy and productive, as well as a more civilized place to live than it was obviously under the Cultural Revolution. But I think obviously it's not being led by Deng Xiaoping type figure right now. It's being led by Xi Jinping, who seems to have a more, to continue the German analogy, is a little bit more like Wilhelm II than Bismarck, and is sort of revealing the nature of what Chinese power is how it's likely to be exercised in the future. I have a book to your challenge, Dr. Kim, coming out hopefully next year, which I hope to have translated into Korean. So I'll tell my agent there's interest. But it lays out in much greater depth why I think this regional hegemony threat is the most consistent one. But I mean, don't ask me. I mean, I think George Kennan, as somebody pointed out, laid this out, that we have an abiding interest in favorable regional balances of power, to your point, in the key theaters, the key industrialized areas, and the industrial, to use an archaic term, but the industrialized areas in Europe are expanding and becoming more important, in particular China, but not only. So, I mean, to me, this is, as Bill Brown pointed out, I look at this from a structural point of view. Our interest as one of the poles in a sort of semi-bipolar with a little bit of features of multipolarity is to ensure that China cannot agglomerate its power over the rest of the region. And I certainly, I take Bill Brown's point, but I have a different view. I mean, I think I don't think you need to take it from me. I think they have been using that, essentially, I mean, I try to think of examples, and then the Chinese provide them every new day. I mean, you go back to the latte and the THAAD incident, but of course they've been trying to use coercive influence against Australia and Vietnam and Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines and Europe and South America. And they're increasingly using the military force. So, I mean, it's not a speculative point. I mean, they are literally fighting the Indian Army on the line of actual control. I mean, things are changing very quickly, and I think it's generally being driven by the growth of their power. Now, to your point, yes, Southeast Asia is a part of the front line. I do think Taiwan, to Dr. Kim's point, is the most significant and delicate point. And to use another analogy, I think my analogy is to the Korean War in 1950. What we actually don't want is, I disagree with Secretary Ashton on this point. I think Korea was the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time. If we had postured ourselves appropriately, we would have communicated to not just Pyongyang, but Beijing and Moscow, that would not get away with it. And then we would not necessarily have had to go to a point where we were spending 13% of GDP on defense. And I think NSC 68, in fact, Bill, that article you mentioned, I wrote with Bob Kaplan in part to try to head off what I fear could become an over-ideologization of this competition along the lines of what happened with NSC 68, actually. That requires that we draw our lines and stick to them. And Dr. Kim, I disagree with your characterization of our policy. We have been clear in the Taiwan Relations Act. Obviously, the 6 assurances have now been declassified, as well as our behavior, that we will not, we regard Chinese use of coercion against Taiwan as a grave threat to our interests. I think we've been pretty clear that we would regard it as, we would come to Taiwan's defense. I think we could be a little bit clearer about that. But that is our pacing scenario. I'm most worried about Taiwan, but Southeast Asia is more of the open field where China has opportunity to work because it's weaker, less developed, and we don't have alliances there other than the Philippines, of course. So I think what China's likely to do is try to make hay in Southeast Asia and Taiwan and try to isolate Japan and South Korea over time. And that's what I'm concerned about. That's why I'm very concerned about Taiwan. I don't think South Korea should. I wouldn't expect South Korea to take an active role in a Taiwan contingency. I would expect Japan to take a more active role, given that it's intimately connected to its security. But that's for another conversation. But overall, I think that's where our concern is, and I think that given the scale of what China can do, we're really going to need to focus on that, and the Korea issues are going to have to be seen through that light. I hope that answers your questions, at least what we can get at in a panel here. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to save around 10 minutes. We have 15 minutes left, but for the session, I'd like to save around 10 minutes for the Q&A session. So before that, I'd like to encourage other participants if they have any comments to make. Yes, John.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you. It's really great to have been invited here by George Washington University Institute for Korean Studies and to be in the company of such great scholars on these issues. Just 1 or 2 points. I do think that Chae-Sung's comments about defining this, the competition between the United States and China, the limits of applying the term Cold War to it, to describe it, I think I do think it is a mischaracterization to do so. However, I do think there are 1 or 2 things that are useful to point out. It is indeed, in my view, a global struggle between the United States and its allies on one hand and China on the other for the world economic order. As Chae-Sung pointed out, the liberal international order, the rules-based system that has allowed countries like South Korea to thrive since the end of World War II. This is what is at stake, and you can talk about, as Bill did, about the issues, the economic issues, and others, structural issues inside of China as being limiting factors in this global effort. But the intent is certainly there, and it's reflected in the activities of their Navy and the global ambitions of having port facilities in places like Gwadar and the Horn of Africa. Those reflect a global ambition to change, to upend the order. And I think we do have to get this alliance of liberal countries who believe in economic competition. Like we have to get that house in order if we really want to oppose China in a meaningful way. Thank you.
Thank you, John. If you have any 2 fingers, I'm going to let you cut in the line, but I don't see anybody. I think Heung-Gyu, as the person who made the opening remarks, may want to make comments on the previous discussion.
If we look at the China report, published by White House, and then also Mike Pompeo, speech, and then this is much more than we actually anticipate, and it's like kind of psychology of a Cold War, because United States didn't really mention the name of the Chinese state, and but the Communist Party, and then didn't really mention the Chinese President Xi Jinping, but saying maybe Communist General Secretary, that kind of, and then ideological kind of conflicts rising. So the front line of conflict is expanding to the even ideology and military and technology and all area, all spheres. So we are afraid of coming conflicts in the military even in the next 5 years. So my question is actually what are the difference between Trump and Biden? And then if they are elected, and then they will have a different policies on Taiwan, and then also the military transformation, and then also the policy on China, that kind of. So I would like to listen to the American friends and this kind of differences.
Thank you. My technical team just told me that Scott and Bill raised their hands. So Scott and Bill.
I think both of these presentations were really quite interesting, but what was surprising to me is that the area that I see the most direct contradiction in among Hung Yu's list of coordination on challenges for South Korea is actually the peace building dilemma. And I think that directly kind of runs into Bridges' view that North Korea policy needs to be seen through the lens of Sino-US rivalry, because it emphasizes the South Korean feeling of a need for relationship with China, but it also puts a kind of burden on the US. Hung Yu simply kind of threw it out and said, well, the US needs to take leadership to solve it. And so the question that I have really for Bridge primarily is, does that mean that the US needs to look at the relationship with North Korea through a geostrategic lens as an object of competition for influence with China, as the South Korean peace-building approach would seem to desire?
I would just add, everybody should take a close look at Vietnam. To me, Vietnam is the big winner right now. They're getting a lot of trade that was going with China, a U.S. trade. Trade is booming. The economy is doing well. It's a big country, actually. It's much bigger than you think. It's much bigger than Korea. And their trade with the U.S. is almost as big as with Korea. And they've so successfully dealt with China without the U.S. alliance. And China going into South China Sea, well, they got to contend with Vietnam, which is not a small obstacle. And if you go around the world, I point Vietnam, but, I like to say China has more troublesome borders than any other country in the world, all the way around it. Who wants to be next to any of the Stans? Who wants to be next to Russia? Who wants to face Japan across the Senkakus? Who wants to face North Korea? It's got so many different problems. I'm not sympathizing them because I can't stand the Communist Party of China, but they have so many troubles that I'm thinking that this idea of warlike competition is just the wrong one to think about. But we should think about, with Korea and with Vietnam and with Russia, everybody sort of dealing with their big corporations, their state corporations. And that's really the focus of this administration. I quite agree. Pompeo's talk I didn't like, tell you the truth. I thought that was way too Cold War-ish. But this is a political season here. I would not pay too much attention to it.
Thank you. So we have 8 minutes left for this session. I'd like to pick up a couple of questions for the participants and ask them to address whichever questions they would like to. So, this is from Scott Simon. Would someone please comment a bit more on South Korea's current diplomatic position vis-a-vis Taiwan and what type of relationship the two militaries have, if any? And Harry Lee from Atlantic Council, what kind of role can we envision South Korea could play in the defense of First Island China, whether it be a Taiwan or Senkaku Island contingency directed to Elbridge? And will it agree to play such a role under a progressive administration that pledged to China in 2016 that it won't deploy additional THAAD missiles and that it will not to strengthen a US, ROC, Japan trilateral alliance? And lastly, I think that this question sounds interesting. Will Australia, South Korea, and Canada draw closer to Europe and or China? I'm sorry for not having enough time to address other questions. We still have the second session, so we can do that. Anybody who want to address one of the questions I just read?
What kind of role South Korea can play to help the United States to protect, the First Island chain? As I already mentioned, the front line of U.S.-China strategic competition is Southeast Asia plus South China Sea area. So I think first one United States should consider is to heighten the priority of Southeast Asia, first of all, which means you need to put more emphasis on, strategic emphasis on Southeast Asia. In this vein, I think South Korea, if not military help or role, South Korea can approach Southeast Asia from the perspective of development cooperation. As far as I know, US and Japan have some institutionalized kind of a consultative mechanism about which country will be receiving ODA, which country will be more, or receiving more ODA or less ODA. This kind of a strategic consultation is being made between US and Japan. I think Korea should be added to the bilateral consultative mechanism, which means South Korea should be able to strengthen the front line so that Southeast Asia may be feeling more affinity strategically toward US, Japan, and South Korea, rather than bandwagoning upon China. So I think the United States is already maintaining a military superiority, and you are sophisticating your strategic doctrines, from air-sea battle to MDO, multi-domain operation kind of a strategy, which is fine. But what is lacking at this point is United States approach from a non-military perspective. So I think South Korea can fill that kind of a hole by consulting on the basis of more proactive development cooperation between Southeast Asia on the one hand and the US, Japan, and Korea on the other. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Elbridge, did you want to go first? And then Hung-Yu.
Sure, yeah. To Scott's point, I think in brief, yes, I think we will need to look at North Korea in that light. And I think over time we will have to consider a wider menu of strategic options. Partially because it seems to me that Pyongyang does not totally want to be under Beijing's thumb. So, of course, I think we're all well, you more than Koreans more than we, but we all feel burned by North Korea. So I don't think there's much credibility there. But yeah, I mean, I think in short, we're going to have to open up the aperture probably. Just kind of address the military issue that both Bill and Sung-Han raised. I mean, I think the one point I'd just say, the last comment that Sung-Han made, I mean, the military balance is much more in doubt than I think you indicate. I mean, you know, numbers are not everything, but as Stalin said, quantity has a quality all its own, and the Chinese actually have a larger Navy than the United States does. And the PLA Air Force in Asia is larger than the American Air Force. And obviously the US does retain some qualitative advantages, but those are shrinking. And of course, China has the advantage of proximity. So to Bill's point, China has the advantage and disadvantage of being a central power, which means, you know, it's on interior lines from a strategic perspective, has a lot of enemies, which is our advantage, but we also have the very thing that is our advantage, which is that we are distant and unlikely to be excessively domineering, is also a disadvantage because we are distant. So, you know, to quote Edward Luttwak, this is sort of the paradox of strategy. And I mean, Bill, I think you're way too sanguine about military use. And I mean, don't take it from me. I mean, you talking about the Vietnamese, the Chinese are ramming Vietnamese vessels with civilian ships, and not to mention others. I mean, they're very aggressive towards the Indonesians, the Philippines, the Malaysians, and of course, they're slitting the throats of Indian soldiers on the line of actual control. So, you know, things can change quite rapidly, and their military has advanced dramatically. And so, I think the ROC's role in a Taiwan contingency, I would personally not stress it a lot. I mean, obviously, politically, it would be difficult, but I think it's most likely to be an air and maritime effort that is primarily going to be about the U.S. There may be access issues that we would want to talk about, but I would focus the ROC more on its own territorial defense primarily, both against North Korea and against China eventually. And Sung-Han, I don't want to quibble, but I wouldn't treat Southeast Asia as the front line so much. I actually think the first island chain and Korea are the front line. In the sense that China's most direct way of projecting military power is out through the first island chain. Southeast Asia is more the open field. So, I mean, Vietnam and the Philippines are sort of direct, but it's more that I think they probably see more opportunity there, so long as we maintain the military balance. But, you know, that's a given. But I agree with your focus on Southeast Asia. One, I think that's critical, and I do think we are moving there. I mean, obviously there's money issues, which along with Japan and others, and maybe the Europeans, and of course the Korea invests a lot in Vietnam, I know. So I totally agree with your point there. But you know, the administration has clarified that the Mutual Defense Treaty with Manila applies to the South China Sea. It's I think commendably shifted its position on China's claims in the South China Sea. So it's taken a more forward-leaning approach. And that's important because I think apropos of Bill's comments on Vietnam is worried, and Hanoi does want, among others, want to see that firmer U.S. presence and posture. So that's important. One final point: I am very skeptical of middle power diplomacy ideas. I don't think we see it, and you know, middle powers don't really have an interest to work together. I mean, you see the Australians aligning much more closely with the United States, Vietnam, others. So I think middle power diplomacy ideas, if they have impact, are probably more likely to be perilous than productive. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Heung-Kyu must have some comments on that.
As far as I understand, that there is no direct official communication and then meeting or dialogue between South Korea and Taiwan. But there is a kind of growing concern over Chinese military advancement, and then also we have kind of disputed area in the sea, with China. So we strongly also support the peaceful unification, and we strongly oppose to the any attempts to unify by non-peaceful means. So if it is necessary, and of course they may be communication on the maybe the track 2 level. So still we are very interested in the Taiwan issues. That's why I question you. And if my observation is correct, and then Southeast Asian countries moving to the kind of position of hedging in the middle of U.S.-China strategy competition. So this is very important, and why they moving to from various areas to the hedging strategies. And then I carefully watch over the position of Philippines. The position of Philippines can be a game changer if Philippines moves to the Beijing closer, and then it opens the Pacific Ocean, and then also the Australia will be will face a kind of direct threat from China. So this is very important, and then it's also the Chinese Navy can maybe surround the Japan and Taiwan, and of course including South Korea. So. But the problem is, as Song Kim correctly pointed out, we don't really see any efficient and effective policies on Southeast Asia of the United States. So this is another concern, and then and also the in the middle of U.S.-China strategic competition. So we still want to see the the vision from the United States for the rest of the world. And this world is quite different from the first Cold War, divided into the two group of competing powers. Between the United States and China, they are competing each other, and then they have a kind of Cold War-like psychologies. However, the rest of the world is still worried about precarious. And what kind of visions the United States has, and then what kind of strategies, and then also the kind of policies they adopted. It's not sure for us. So this is the problem. And then, so anyway, we can discuss further. I don't want to dominate.
Thank you. With that, I'd like to wrap up and conclude the first session and turn it over to Hung-Kyu for the second session.